So in this segment, we're going to be talking about an article in the Express where the author claims the only way to save Brexit now is to make the EU irrelevant, claims John Longsworth. And so I read through this article. It was I was a bit mixed on it. It wasn't the worst piece of Brexit writing I've seen, but it's a bit delusional in places. My cat disagrees, if you can hear him in the background clearly. So he says, there are some hard truths which need to be recognised about Brexit and the state of British politics. Brexit has happened. True. Not the best analysis there. We know this. He says, it's strange that I feel it necessary to say this 7 years after the referendum, but there are still arguments about it, in particular amongst those in power or with influence. The assertion may seem an odd claim to Remoaners who assert that Brexit is flawed, producing a failure of delivery. Brexiteers, for their part, claim it has not been delivered because it's been undermined by the Remain elite. And, if Brexit was going to be so easy and so great, how was it undermined so much then? We're many years into this and Brexiteers are still pushing the stab in the back stuff. It's just embarrassing. Right-wingers will tell people to take ownership on things we don't really have much control over, but over Brexit, Remainers are to blame. When are they going to accept some responsibility for the mess that they've made? Both contain an element of hard truth. He's talking about the Brexiter and Remainer arguments, but still Brexit has happened and we should really be discussing, instead of a Brexit done and dusted, how to make Britain more prosperous. The problem is that it is also intrinsically linked to Brexit, and wow, a Brexiteer, that's actually met us part way. That's something. And he's right to a degree that Brexit is linked to the prosperity of the future of the UK. The author tries to claim that Brexit has not done much damage, but we can see the damage it's done. Food has gone up in price dramatically, especially if you compare it to EU member states. Certain products are scarce, tomatoes. Huge labour shortages across the board. Productivity down by around 4%. GDP is still not back up to pre-pandemic levels. Long queues at Dover in the holiday periods. Forget about it. Going on holiday, forget about it, especially by Dover. Easter break might end up being an annual Brexit blockage. So, with all of these things in mind, how is he going to make Brexit a success or anything like that? And, the author claims that, the Brexit that Mr. Johnson delivered was a substantial one for Britain and an incomplete one for the UK. And, he's arguing because Northern Ireland is still in the single market for goods. But how is this a substantial Brexit given what the problems I've mentioned above? It doesn't work. The author claims that it was the only real politic that would allow, given the phalanx of resistance in Parliament, Whitehall and the media, with the resultant risk to Brexit Britain that a no-deal exit would have presented, given the fifth column this represented, however preferable that a no-deal Brexit might have been. And, I think I read it as a Brexiteer acknowledging that no-deal would have done no-deal Brexit would have done a lot of damage. But it doesn't actually look like he has done. The author is trying to argue that Johnson was put into a box by the media as comical. The overwhelming print media supports the Tories. The TV media was very timid in calling Johnson's lies out around the protocol before it was implemented. Even around the free trade agreement he got, the news journalists were very timid. He talked about no non-tariff barriers, barely called him out on it because they didn't bother to read the thing. You can see that he set up the stage for claiming Johnson had no choice but to sign the deal that he signed, i.e. the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is malarkey. But he goes on to blame May. So he says, it was also a deal which stitched us up, the May-Hammond administration having delivered up the UK to the EU on a plate. The PM and the Chancellor had done their level best to keep us tied as closely as possible to the EU. We would have been a vassal state. And again, this is nonsense. The May deal was based around the idea that once the Tories found a solution for the Irish border, then the UK would be free to do whatever it wanted, as long as the solution was viable. The May deal was about upholding the Good Friday Agreement but ending freedom of movement, so that was why it was so disjointed. But keeping the UK in the single market would have been a deal I think the EU wanted for us. So the idea that May served us up to the EU is nonsense. And the idea that, I don't like May, but, she was trying to balance the Good Friday Agreement, the clowns at the DUP and the racist Brexiteers, because May thought Brexit was about ending freedom of movement. That's what Brexiteers mainly talked about, taking back control of our borders. That's as far as May read into it. So, the points that they come up with is nonsense because, May took us out of the single market effectively, which, that would have been what I think most people would have wanted. But it's just ridiculous that the arguments they make here. He says Boris did at least escape the customs union trap, but he left behind Northern Ireland in accepting the protocol. He also weaponised the argument deployed by the establishment for dynamic alignment, lest Northern Ireland be left behind, thus creating a ball and chain for the UK, which the EU has employed to keep Great Britain in their orbit. And in my opinion, we didn't leave Northern Ireland behind. We had we managed to stay in the single market, which was on the table at the time, so we didn't have to leave Northern Ireland behind. But because of May's idea that we had to end freedom of movement, she felt like she was put in a box. The reason we would want dynamic alignment in the context of Northern Ireland is to avoid as many border checks in the Irish Sea as possible, so that it would placate the Unionists. At least it may have helped. But now we have a situation where the Unionists are angry, and the more regulatory kind of de-alignment, for lack of a better word, that we have with the EU, the more checks that are going to happen in the Irish Sea, and the more rabid the Unionists are going to become, because it can get a lot worse than it is now. All of this has been brought into sharp focus by the parliamentary drama around the PM Sunak's take it or leave it Northern Ireland deal. The hard truth is that if Brexit is to fulfil its business and economic potential, this must not be allowed to continue with or without Northern Ireland. So the author is basically happy for more checks to happen in the Irish Sea and see Unionists even more isolated as the UK diverges from EU rules even more, creating more regulatory hurdles as well. So clearly another Brexiteer who doesn't care about the Union. He says there has been much wringing of hands over the betrayal of Northern Ireland. The attempts to reverse this, however, have failed, and therefore other hard truths must be faced. He says Northern Ireland is a complex subject, and oversimplified is a danger, but in a nutshell, the sovereignty of Northern Ireland within the UK was compromised years ago by the Good Friday Agreement. It was the price of peace, and Northern Ireland's place in the Union was hardly compromised. It solidified Northern Ireland's place in the Union until Northern Ireland itself wants to leave. The Irish nationalists cannot change that. As much pressure as they want to put on the British government or the people of Northern Ireland, ultimately it's in the hands of the people of Northern Ireland when they want to change, and that is the ultimate mark of national self-determination, which is something the author talks about in the article. But this idea that Northern Ireland sovereignty was kind of reached by the Good Friday Agreement is nonsense, absolute nonsense. If anything, they were given more power by the Good Friday Agreement, not less. He says the EU protocol was a betrayal by Mrs May's government and had been a Gordian knot ever since. So the term Gordian knot, commonly used to describe a complex or unsolvable problem, according to the History Channel. The issue is not that the protocol created this mess we have now. It was Brexit. A border had to go somewhere due to the hard Brexit we chose to do. So we know what the issue is. It's Brexit fundamentally. It was specifically the hard Brexit we chose, but it was Brexit. The reality of the practical ramifications, he says, of this will no doubt become apparent, but in no way should divergence from Northern Ireland be allowed to prevent GB from advantageous divergence from the EU. There is no doubt that there is an abundance of advantages to be had, particularly in tax policy, deregulation and trade, and I find this very frustrating. Very nebulous terms win again. Tax policy we had, you have control over as an EU member. I think VAT was the only real issue because there are minimum thresholds for VAT, but we have higher VAT than a lot of EU states. In fact, certain EU states, like I think it's Spain and Portugal, have cut their VAT on energy to 0%. The UK is still at 5%. We could have cut income taxes or corporation tax if we wanted to. On deregulation, what does he want to deregulate and why? Can they be specific about what they want here? Because we've deregulated the rules around sewage dumping in the waterways, and now our waterways are some of the worst in Europe. Despite the fact that we had very good water quality a few years ago. So what does he want deregulated? On trade as well, can they do the same? Be specific about what they want. Because even the CPTPP stuff will not make up for what we've lost in EU trade. I think they're talking about the CPTPP adding 0.08% to our GDP. That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. He says the best chance for Northern Ireland now is in GB becoming a post-Brexit success and gradually becoming less involved in EU trade, so that eventually the EU becomes much less irrelevant. That is the hard truth, and it's funny because the opposite will happen. If Northern Ireland gets stable, we'll see more investment go over there due to the fact that it has access to GB and the EU single market for goods. This idea that GB will shine and do so well it will eclipse Northern Ireland and the EU is a myth. Northern Ireland's biggest problem outside of the DUP will be staff. and that would be a result of the no freedom of movement and braver and stupid immigration policies. So, what he said is malarkey, absolute malarkey. The Brexit we have, he says, the Brexit we have is the genuine article. It provided for a sovereign parliament answerable to the British people and thus gave us liberty and self-determination. That was the nub of Brexit. The argument is now, what do we do with that self-determination? Albeit there are those who would like to reverse our self-determination. And, for me, this idea that we did not have self-determination is a myth. Go ask the former colonies what having self-determination actually means, because they didn't have control over their countries or their futures. We always had a sovereign parliament. We always have had that, but now they can't hide and blame the EU for all of their problems, at least for the most part. When you look at stuff like the asylum seeker, in the asylum seekers in the English Channel, we can't blame the EU for that mess. Of all the channel crossings, we have to accept responsibility. Now, when it comes to British politicians, they have to stance up and deflect elsewhere for their failures. They can't keep blaming the EU. The author says, another hard truth is that the practical benefit of Brexit lies in Britain being better off and more secure. I would personally have been prepared for the country to pay a short-term reduction in GDP for our freedom alone, but in the knowledge that the long-term economic benefits would pay dividends. And again, this is nonsense. The UK is the only G7 member that has not reached its pre-pandemic levels and is still a while off doing that. It's also the weakest member of the G7 growth-wise. You can argue that Germany is not doing much better than us, but Germany is way more exposed to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whilst the UK is mostly isolated from it versus other European countries. I think once we hit the middle and end parts of the 2020s, we will continue to see the UK struggle, because Brexit has really capped our success. And once more of the financial service sector stuff kicks in, it should be more easy to really see the Brexit impacts, given how reliant the UK is on the financial services sector. When we look at the graph here, this is Q4 2022 compared with Q4 2019. This was updated the 31st of March, just gone. These are the most accurate figures I think they have so far. The UK's growth figures at 0.6%, so we're still nowhere near really pre-pandemic levels. Germany have hit their pre-pandemic levels just about, despite being very exposed to the Russian invasion on Ukraine. Japan have made it. France, Italy, despite people saying Italy's a constant basket case, they've made it back up. The Eurozone are 2.4% higher than they were back before the pandemic, and that's including the fact that they are, a lot of the Eurozone members have been way more damaged by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then you've got kind of the two countries that haven't been impacted that much, the Canadians and the Americans. They're doing quite well, but when you look at, kind of compare it to the European countries here, we are doing worse than them. The author says, in fact, we have had little negative Brexit impact while being able to escape the annual membership fee, which would be running at excess of 22 billion per annum. But the problem with his analysis is that we are still paying into the EU's budget because of the divorce settlement. So that's nonsense, because of our the agreements we had into the EU's budget. So we're still paying in. So this idea that we've somehow escaped the budget makes no sense. And if you look at how much the UK are paying in VAT, VAT and customs duties, that 22 billion figure won't be looking so great. He says the UK has outperformed EU peers, especially Germany in GDP growth and many others since the referendum, including unemployment. Everything from now is on the upside. And so the author uses the figures from 2016, which makes absolutely no sense, because we didn't leave the EU fully until the end of 2020. That's when the transitional period ended, I think. When you look at the numbers since we left the transitional period, you can see we're not doing so great. Combining it with COVID makes it hard to argue that the UK is not an outlier for the worst, for bad reasons. All of these members are back up to where they were except the UK. So this idea that, we're running better than Germany makes absolutely no sense when you compare it to kind of pre-pandemic levels here. Absolute malarkey. Looking at unemployment, for the most part, it's not the best metric. We have a record number of vacancies without people to fill those roles. It means, like I said, the UK success is capped because you need people for the economy to grow. You need people to fill up those job roles. And if you don't have that, businesses are going to struggle to expand, which means you're not going to get much growth. The author says we should remember that it was not the ERG that removed Mrs May's government. The ERG failed. The hard truth is that it was the performance of the Brexit Party in the EU elections that scared the parliamentary party sufficiently to precipitate regime change and put Boris Johnson in power. And this, for me, This, for me, is the most stupid paragraph in the article. No one in the UK cared about EU elections, hence why we kept sending clowns like Farage and Ben Habib. I don't know why the author is claiming that the Brexit Party's performance in the EU elections, were the thing that triggered the Tory Party to get rid of May. It's absolute malarkey. May went because she lost the support of her party. The rebellion was led by the ERG, and they kept voting against her Withdrawal Act. In the end, she won the vote of no confidence, but you never really win one of those. She was told that if she didn't go, they would change the rules, and they would vote against her again. And May, being the kind of party stooge that she is, she did what was in the interest of the party, and she went. And this idea that it was the Brexit Party's pressure on in the EU elections, absolute baloney. Absolute baloney. These kind of UKIP type parties have always done well in the EU elections coming out of the UK because people didn't care about EU elections. The turnouts were incredibly low. The author says, just as the Cameron-Osborne austerity of the post-financial crises were both unnecessary and wrongly attributed to Labour spending, but were much more linked to the City of London, the current austerity is a construct in order to facilitate the current administration. And, I wonder if he blamed the City of London at the time. I tried to find out, I couldn't find out much. The person who wrote this article was the head of the British Chamber of Commerce as well. But it goes to show you that austerity was the wrong policy then, and over 10 years on, people can finally admit it. And once again, austerity will be the wrong policy going into this kind of next part of this decade. Growth economics is the answer, he says. More government is never the answer. The hard truth is that growth was in fact the answer, and the Bank of England covered its failure by denying this, and Mercer's Sunak and Hunt used it to seize power. Again, what does growth economics mean? How do you grow the economy? Because in this article, the author did not tell us beyond the broad terms of tax cuts and deregulation. The Bank of England do deserve some blame. They keep raising interest rates, which I think is a really bad idea and will make the economic problems last longer. But then again, they are limited in what they can do, and Bailey is limited intellectually, and also he's limited in what he can actually say here. But, he doesn't want to pick a fight with the Tories and make the Bank of England kind of politicised, which is what happened with Mark Carney. They kept politicising the Bank of England, even though Mark Carney did a decent job. In any event, he says, the EU will continue its relative economic decline, and as always, it is a house of cards of debt. The hard truth is that the forces of Remain must not prevail. Already, Whitehall is delaying and denying deregulation. This will only lead to declinism, the comfort zone, it seems, of the ruling elite. And, I think the EU members are a lot more stable, or a bit more stable, at least since the financial crash in 2008. They have dealt with the pandemic better than the UK, and even the countries that are classed as developing economies in the EU are developing very well. They do need to check on the kind of more right-wing authoritarian elements of certain members of the EU bloc, but I think they're doing a lot better than they were, 15 years ago. I would not call it a house of cards, that's for sure. The forces of Remain have consistently failed since the 2016 referendum, so please stop blaming Remain for the Brexit problems. We failed in 2016, failed in 2017, failed spectacularly in 2019. So this idea that it's up, Remain are the stiflers in the Brexit kind of anything related to Brexit is nonsense. They're their own worst enemies. And again, deregulation will not fix the UK's problems; it'll only make it worse. The UK will default to austerity under Sunak, and my fear is that a future Labour government will continue austerity, maybe to a lesser degree, but I think we would not see the end of austerity for a long time, given kind of the lack of economic imagination of the Labour Party, and specifically Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. It will be better under them than it will under the Tories, but I do wonder if they'll get rid of austerity as a policy, considering that it just chokes off any economic growth that we can have. It was a bad policy under David Cameron. It's a bad policy under Rishi Sunak now. And so from this article, not the worst one I've read from the Express, not the most deranged one, but some really bad takes here and there. So not that impressed in terms of quality, but it is the Express. At least the Telegraph pulls out their big hitters when they try and write propaganda pieces, rather than this John Longsworth guy who makes a mess of himself on Twitter every other day. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.